together and start moving in that direction. That's what's perfect. All right, field trip people. We need to leave in about 5 minutes. Gather on down here. Be sure you have all the equipment that you need. That's clipboards, hula hoops, lines if you have them, something to write with especially. Let's get a move on.
Curiosity pulls biologists towards the ocean in search of clues about nature's patterns and processes. At the same time, the moon and sun work together to pull the ocean waters of the Earth away from the beach. This tidal force creates a unique area of the shore, the intertidal zone, where a thin slice of the sea floor is exposed to the air and to us each day. Today, these students leave their books behind and venture into nature's classroom. This shore habitat, located just 60 miles from the Arizona-Mexico border in the Sea of Cortez, is rich with marine life and is an excellent living laboratory in which to study. Using scientific methods, the class will try to answer ecological questions about relationships between the intertidal organisms and their environment. Let's join the class and their instructor, biologist Steve MacKie, as they investigate this intertidal habitat and the organisms found there.
Here we are sitting on the bottom of the ocean. Twice a day, tidal movements of water will sweep the water up over this shore up to a high point up here, and then sweep it down to a low point below us. The area that we're actually sitting on now may be under as much as 15 feet of water at a high tide. In Rocky Point, twice a day, water movements sweep up and down this beach. Imagine that you're an intertidal creature who lives here. For example, this snail. Let's take a look at these, we'll pass them out. This snail has to deal with a tremendous number of different conditions every day. You live in this intertidal, and at 4 o'clock in the morning, you're under 15 feet of water. You know, there's a little bit of a surge of water, and your main concerns are probably avoiding being eaten by other creatures that live in and around the rocks here. By 7 o'clock in the morning, water's starting to sweep down here, and we have waves in this area. And the main things it needs to worry about then are being swept off the rock, maybe down into a crevice here, maybe into the mouth of a waiting sea anemone here, or maybe it be swept completely off these boulders and down to an area where it can't even feed. So it has to cling to the rock and deal with that moving water. By 10 o'clock, the water is pretty far below it, and at 200 feet above it is the arid Sonoran Desert. Its main problems that it needs to deal with then are the problems dealing with breathing. Remember that a snail breathes with gills and basically needs water to breathe, and overheating. It could get as much as 105, 110 degrees out here. It's sitting on a black rock too, which doesn't exactly help it with its overheating problems. So it sits here and it feeds on barnacles, which is its main source of food. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the water is now coming back up here, and the same problems it had before with having to stay in its position on the boulder and worry about water movement are happening. So it has to stay here so it doesn't get swept off the boulder or swept out to the deeper parts of the ocean. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 15 feet of water rise above it again, and it needs to be concerned about the fact that there are animals that may come out from underneath these boulders and may want it as a prey item. Crabs or octopus, whatever. The water will then rise up to a high water mark above this, as I said, and then start to sweep its way back down again, exposing this area and uncovering it, and the cycle repeats over and over and over. All right, what we're seeing here and what we're sitting around is a tidal pool. It's a little pocket of water left over as the tide moved away from these rocks. And you can see it is full of all kinds of creatures. Tide pools are generally some of the most beautiful parts of the intertidal. We only have a few minutes to look at this one before the water sweeps back up here again. Let's start by reviewing some of the creatures that we have to know in order to do this study effectively. The first one is one I think you're already real familiar with. This is Acanthina angelica. Does everybody see it? Acanthina is the spine snail that eats barnacles, and we've already talked a lot about it and the problems that it encounters in the intertidal. Another creature that's right here sitting, he's actually filtering some water right here, is the sea cucumber, Solenchothuria lubrica. Also, it's sometimes called the sulfur cucumber because of some of the yellowish color that you see. Sea cucumbers are actually related to starfish, brittle stars, sea urchins, sand dollars, all members of the phylum Echinodermata, the spiny skinned animals. Solenchothuria, as you already saw, filters seawater using some specialized filtering structures that it can stick out of the front of its body. It filters organic matter, that is anything edible, that's in this water, filters it out into some sticky mucus on these gills, and then pulls those in and takes the stuff out and uses it as its food. It's generally found underneath boulders, and we might find clusters of 1 or 10 underneath the boulder when we turn it over. All right, what we need to do is quickly cover some of these creatures that are actually living here in the tide pool before the tide sweeps up over this rock. This creature right over here, Joe, would you point to it? That's Palithoa ignota. Palithoa is actually a colony of anemones all joined at their base. And like all the anemones, and in fact all of the stinging-celled animals, it actually has tentacles that contain stinging cells that are used to immobilize or paralyze prey items and also hold on to them. After they've been immobilized or paralyzed, they're moved into the mouth, which is at the center of all those tentacles. This particular creature generally does not grow very far out of water. It's real sensitive to dryness. It's also green because it contains algae in its tissues, and that algae may be real useful to it during some tough times when it can't get enough to eat. Other creatures in this tide pool that are interesting include this plant. We haven't talked about any plants yet. This is a red coralline algae. It's a member of the phylum Rhodophyta, which is one of the plant groupings, and it's actually called a coralline algae because it concentrates hard, rock-like calcium carbonate in its tissues, which makes it tough and brittle. We want to take a look at it. It is a red algae, so it does photosynthesize. That means it gets most of its energy by solar power. While we're talking about algae, let's talk about a completely different group of algae that we need to be familiar with, and that's the brown algae. The example that we'll be studying is this one right over here. This is Podina. Podina is a member of what's called the brown algae, or Phaeophyta. The Phaeophytans are some of the most commercially used algae and some of the commonest plant residents of intertidals. They also photosynthesize in order to make their food. Podina is a good one to study because it's easy to recognize, and it also occurs in real distinct clumps that we can count.
Does this contain chlorophyll and a different type of pigment, or does it just have chlorophyll?
It contains different kinds of chlorophyll, including brown kinds of chlorophyll, that tend to make it look brown. So in this case, it looks pretty green. If some of that green pigment dissolved away, it would appear more brown, and some of the algae, especially the kelps, appear quite brown.
Yeah.
All right, we ought to be kind of safe here for a few minutes. The tide is still coming up pretty fast, but we're kind of up high enough so we ought to be able to cover some more of the animals we need to cover so we can get ready to do our survey. Let's start with this guy. This is Turbofluctuosos, sometimes called the turban snail because of the turban-like shape of its body. It's large, it's conspicuous, you ought not to have too much trouble recognizing it. Turbofluctuosos is a grazer, so it opens up and crawls around on rocks or boulders, and it scrapes algae off using its tongue, which is covered with scraping structures, sort of like sandpaper. The next creature I want to show you is in this bucket already, and I definitely want to be careful in picking it up. This is the fireworm, Urothoe complanata. Urothoe is one of the annelids. I'll put him down here in this tide pool. Annelid worms are segmented worms that generally live in sand or underneath boulders in the intertidal. They're detritus feeders, which means that they actually eat whole bunches of sand and extract the organic materials or usable nutrients from the sand that they take in their mouth as that sand passes through their body. You definitely want to be careful in handling Urothoe because it has spines along its sides which are sort of like glass, fine pointed glass that are coated with a layer of poison. It will definitely sting and hurt you if you pick it up. All right, let's move on to some other creatures in this bucket. We do have a bunch of them. This guy right here, this is Modiolus, and Modiolus is a mussel. Mussels are part of the same group of snails and octopi and clams. These are creatures that filter water to make a living. They actually have an elaborate filtering system inside that allows them to create a little current of water that they pull through their body, and they use hairs and mucus to trap stuff in that water. Once it's trapped on the gills, it can be moved down into the mouth, and that's how they feed. A lot of ocean creatures make their living by filtering seawater, which is full of rich nutrients and plankton or microscopic creatures to eat. A couple members of the phylum Echinodermata we need to discuss. Here's two of them. This pincushion-like creature is what's called a sea urchin. This particular one is Echinometra. Now, certainly you can see why this one would fit into the spiny-skinned animals. It has 2 feet like most spiny-skinned animals, but it certainly has spines. Echinometra is also a grazer. That means it's going to scrape creatures, and especially plants, off the bottom of rocks or off the sides of rocks and use it for its food. In the same basic group of animals, that is the echinoderms or spiny-skinned creatures, is a creature like this. This is a brittle star. Brittle stars are called brittle because they have a way of letting go or breaking off their arms if they need to. They may be doing it by accident, or they may be doing it on purpose just to avoid being preyed upon or eaten by something. I'm going to put this guy over here in the water.
Does that part regenerate?
It'll definitely grow back. If it breaks off one of its arms, it can grow one back pretty fast.
What do brittle stars feed on?
Brittle stars also feed on whatever they can find, meaning organic stuff under rocks. I mean, they may eat a piece of fish, or they may eat a piece of snail, or they may actually scrape some stuff off rocks and eat it, about whatever they can find. All right, let's move on. We've covered fireworms and echinoderms. The interesting creature that's in here that we need to take a look at and falls into the same group as mussels, snails like turbo, is this guy right here. And this is not a creature we're going to find enough of that we need to worry about in our survey, but I mean, I can't miss a chance to look at probably one of the most intelligent invertebrates. And this is an octopus. I guess this looks to me like Octopus degeti. I'm really not sure. There are about 3 species of octopus here. Now, octopi are also mollusks, which means that they're soft-bodied creatures that may have a shell. This particular one, its shell is inside of its body. And at the center of its arms right here is a beak-like structure that it uses to crush its prey, probably mainly crabs and crustaceans like that. You can absolutely feel the suction cups on the bottom of it. Look at that.
How can an animal like that defend itself?
Well, an animal like this probably defends itself primarily by escaping. I mean, it's fast, it can squeeze through little holes, and it just plainly escape predators that way. But most octopi and squids also have the ability to secrete sort of like a cloud of purple poison, a poison liquid that irritates predators and poisons them, and just generally allows the octopus a chance to escape while it confuses them with, as I said, a puff of purple poison. All right, the last creature that's in this bucket, and I need to be real careful in trying to grab this guy, is the lumpy-clawed crab. This is a Rifia, and I think you can see why he's called lumpy claws. The reason I'm being so careful when I grab this guy is that this crab actually feeds on snails, and it crushes their shells to get what's inside, and it could certainly do a good job on me with these claws. Rifia is a member of the crustaceans, or actually the phylum Arthropoda, the jointed-footed animals, the class Crustacea. That puts him in the same class as creatures like shrimp and lobsters and all the other crabs. I'm going to put
Is that
this guy.
Is that a male or a female?
This is a male. I can tell that by looking underneath here at its little telson or tail. Anyway, I'm going to put this guy back in the bucket before it rips one of my fingers off. The next creature we need to look at are some of these barnacles which are growing on the rocks over here. So why don't we get up and move over there, and we'll talk about those when we get there. These bumpy, kind of volcano-shaped creatures that you see right here are barnacles. This is Tetraclitus squamosa, and its common name is the thatched hut barnacle. You can probably see why it's called that. Barnacles of all kinds are unusual creatures, and they're related to the jointed-footed animals. That's the phylum Arthropoda. And in fact, they look sort of like a shrimp that's glued its shoulders to the rock and is using its feathered feet to reach out of the shell it makes and filter seawater. What it catches in its feet, it brings back into the shell, and it eats it.
At this time, the students have become familiar with the most common organisms found in the intertidal zone, and they are about to begin their field research projects. Their field instructor issues a few last instructions to make sure everyone knows the organisms, has the proper equipment, and knows what their particular job is. The students will lay out a line perpendicular to the shore called a transect line, which they use for reference. Along the transect, at intervals, they then isolate a piece of the intertidal zone, which will be carefully examined. Within this sample area, every individual of the common species we have just seen will be counted. This is done in order to create an accurate, objective picture of the way different animals are distributed throughout the intertidal zone. The students work in pairs, one person counting the individual organisms, the other carefully recording the numbers on the data sheet.
Okay, we got 6, 7, 8 more of that same one we just had.
Okay.
Do you know, is this that same one that he showed us before? Are we supposed to count this one?
I don't know.
What's
What's that?
Steve, is this, what was it called? The turbo? Are we supposed to count that one?
No, this is Tegula. This isn't one of the species that we need to count.
What's the difference between the two?
Well, Tegula's got a lot more shiny stuff on there. Look at that barnacle on there. That's pretty amazing. Basically, Tegula's a lot smoother, a lot less bumps and or whatever they call them, denticles or tubercles or whatever.
Steve.
The shape is pretty darn similar, though.
Steve.
Yeah, I'll be right there.
We'll find out what else we got here. All right, so we had 7 of that. We can't count him. Let's see if there's something else. Have we found any of those cucumbers? Not a one.
No.
Okay, I think we've got most of these rocks. About how many layers should we turn over?
All right, I really don't think it's necessary that we go any deeper than the first kind of upper layer of rocks. A lot of this real small stuff here is moving around so much that there's not going to be much stuff underneath it or whatever. Okay? When you move this layer of rocks out, you'll be able to count whatever's underneath it and be sure that you put the rocks right back in the position that they were when you started counting.
Well, why? What happens if we don't?
Well, you know, the creatures that live on the top of these rocks and the creatures that live on the bottom, you know, are designed to be right there. I mean, that's the way they're going to live the best. If we turn it over, not only are we going to be disturbing this habitat, but everything that's pretty much on the top of the rock will die, and everything that's on the bottom. Things that are on the top need to be out of the water, maybe need to have sunlight to photosynthesize. Things that are on the bottom need to be protected by that rock when the tide's in or out.
Although the students have a basic understanding of the creatures and the habitat, there are reasons for making careful written counts and observations. It will be useful to have these population census numbers for later classroom use, such as making graphs or charts. In fact, most scientific research, especially studies of nature, begins with simply counting, carefully observing, and noting what is found during the study. After hours of observation and data collection in this arid desert environment, the shade of a nearby beach house on the cliff overlooking the intertidal zone is a welcome relief. Now, the class can gather together and share their observations and experiences, as well as summarize their findings. It is time to take a break and to reflect on and discuss the larger picture and the meaning of the day's observations.
What we're going to be doing now is kind of getting our information out, and I can see everybody has their clipboards and data, and we're going to start summarizing some of that data, and we've got a lot of different kinds. But I think what we want to do is start by just looking at the simple numbers of animals that we actually counted in the different tidal levels. So if you would look on your paperwork, try and figure out, maybe add things up if you need to, clarify it a little bit, so that we can see just how many species we found at every one of the tidal levels. All right, has everybody managed to get the data together, the numbers together for the actual number of species at each tidal height? I'll ask each group to just kind of give me your number. We'll add them up here, get them all up here on the board, and we'll do a little average so we can see the average number of species at any tidal height, okay? Group number one, how many species did you find in the high zone?
We found 3.
3. Group number two, high zone for you, your numbers.
We found about
4. Group number 3.
5.
5. Oh, that's easy enough to deal with. We've got 3, 4, and 5. The average of 3, 4, and 5, I think.
Yep.
4. All right. How about the mid-zone? Group number 1, what was your number of species in the mid-zone? Total number of species?
We had 10.
10.
Yeah, we found 10 different species. Big difference.
All right. Group number 2?
Yeah, we got 9.
9. Group number 3?
We got
Pork, my God,
Wow.
pork meat. Okay,
Got easy
20,
rock.
33. Average of that is 11. All right. Finally, low zone. Numbers for group number 1. Total number of species.
7.
7. Group number 2.
10.
10. And group number 3. 7 again. All right. Average of that is 8. We have an average number of 4 species in the high zone, average number of 11 in the mid zone, average number of 8 in the low zone, with 3 samples at each height. Let's just take a real quick look at that looks like graph. I mean, I think you can see a pretty clear pattern here. Somebody just, in a sentence or so, give me a real quick.
We've got the most number of species in the mid-zone. Is that right?
The highest number, the peak in this curve, if we can represent a curve by these three dots, the peak definitely occurs in the mid-zone. Does anybody find that surprising?
It would seem to me that there'd be the highest number of species the further out we got from shore.
Yeah, I would have thought that too, unless like the mid zone, maybe just because it has more rocks, more substrate for the organisms to hide under.
It's almost like you'd predict that it would go sort of like this.
Almost straight up.
Yeah, that's what I would thought.
Let's brainstorm a little about this problem. Why is it that you think that there are more species in the middle intertidal than there are in the low intertidal or the high intertidal? What is it that's forming that peak in the center of the intertidal? Anybody have any ideas?
Well, it could be that in the lower area there's more water because the tide comes in that way. So there's always more water there. It's deeper. So there could be more fish and more predators in that region. And then the upper area is very hard to live in because it's always exposed to the sun, or practically always exposed to the sun. So the mid-range would be ideal.
All right, so there's sort of there's like some kind of serious physical problems in the high intertidal and maybe some biological problems in the low intertidal. Any other ideas?
Well, the mid zone seems to have a lot of boulders and a lot of rocks that seems to be ideal for substrate, and it's not exposed as much to the.
A lot more places for the different types of animals to live, a lot more
Yeah.
different places.
Yeah.
All right, so there's a lot of...
Each pair of students counted the number of species found in the high, mid, and low intertidal zone. After averaging and graphing the data, the class discovers that the most species were found in the mid-intertidal zone. They now attempt to explain this pattern by forming what is called a hypothesis. Their hypothesis is that more species are found in the mid-intertidal zone because there is a larger number of boulders found there.
Which of the ideas that we've talked about do people seem to feel is the most accurate? The one that we might be interested in generating a hypothesis about that we can test?
I think it's because of the number of different types of livable space in the mid-zone, all the boulder zone. We've got all the cracks and crevices, a lot of places to live and hide.
Yeah, well, there's basically more surface area in the mid-zone for these antelopes. Like, if you were to go in the low region, it's sandy and there's just a few rocks. The high has these big boulders, so maybe more surface area as well. Actually, we can sort of like combine them.
So in the boulder zone, there's more room for things to be, and there's more little cracks and crevices for them to hide in. I mean, how do people feel? Most people feel like that's reasonable, reasonable explanation for why there are more species there than otherwise.
That makes sense.
So supposing we wanted to go out there and we wanted to test that as an idea. I mean, if the hypothesis is that there is a higher species number in the middle intertidal because there are more places to hide because there's a boulder zone sitting there, if we could find an area that didn't have very many boulders, we could compare the transect data that we collected today with lots of boulders and a species number peak in the middle with a transect that does not have very many boulders, and that sort of factors out the boulders, as something that increases species number. So tomorrow we might want to go down there.
The class agrees that the high number of species living in the mid-intertidal zone is due to the large number of boulders found there. These boulders provide important places for organisms to attach to or live in. Tomorrow, the class will be back in the intertidal zone and will test their new hypothesis by comparing the number of species found in an area with many boulders to the number of species found in an area with very few boulders. In the pursuit of knowledge using the scientific method, for each question answered, new questions often arise. Studying in nature's classroom allows us to follow our curiosity and attempt to answer these new questions. A field trip like this one is an excellent way to learn firsthand about nature while enjoying the outdoors with friends at the same time. So when you're ready, nature's classroom will be waiting.